The text came in at 9:47 p.m., and I read it 3 times before I put my phone down. Miss you. Can't wait to be home. Love you. My name is Renee, and I'm 35. I'd been married to my husband, Mark, for 9 years, and that night I was sitting on our couch with a glass of wine going warm beside me, a true crime show playing on mute because I'd lost interest 20 minutes in, and I felt, for just a second, that small, warm flood of relief that comes from a message like that. Mark had been in Denver for 4 days, at a regional sales conference for his company, and the house had been too quiet without him in a way I hadn't expected after 9 years of marriage. I worked as a high school English teacher, and that week, grading essays alone in the evenings, eating dinner standing at the counter because the table felt too big for one, I'd missed him more than I usually let myself admit. I texted back, "Miss you too. Almost there, 2 more days. Love you." I put the phone face down on the couch cushion beside me, picked my wine back up, and let myself relax into the kind of ordinary, unremarkable evening that makes up most of a life, the kind you don't remember individually, except that this one, it turned out, I would remember for the rest of my life, because of what happened exactly 40 minutes later. My phone buzzed again. Not from Mark, from Instagram, a notification I almost didn't open, because I rarely checked the app at night. But something made me glance at it, and what I saw stopped my hand halfway to setting the phone back down. A photo. Posted by Ashley, one of Mark's coworkers, someone I'd met a handful of times at company events, always pleasant, always a little too friendly in the practiced way some people are. The photo showed a hotel rooftop bar, string lights, a skyline I recognized from the conference website Mark had sent me earlier that week. And in the photo, laughing, glasses raised, was a small group of people, and right at the edge of the frame, close enough that there was no question about it, was Mark. The caption read, "Best night of the conference." Clinking glasses. I sat there, the show still playing silently on the screen in front of me, my wine glass halfway to my mouth, and felt the strangest thing happen, not panic, not yet. Just a kind of quiet recalibration, the sense of 2 pieces of information sitting side by side that didn't fit together the way they should. Miss you. Can't wait to be home. Sent at 9:47. A rooftop bar. String lights. Glasses raised. Posted at 10:27. I had no idea, sitting there on my couch with the volume muted and my wine going warmer by the second, that this was the moment, this exact, ordinary Tuesday night, when the version of my marriage I'd believed in for 9 years would begin, very quietly, to come apart. Not with a confession. Not with a confrontation. Just with a photo, posted by someone who had no idea I'd ever see it. To understand why that photo felt so wrong, not just strange, but wrong, in a way I couldn't immediately name, you have to understand what Mark's text had actually meant. Mark traveled for work fairly often, 3 or 4 times a year, sales conferences and client visits, usually 3 to 5 days at a time. And over 9 years, a particular rhythm had developed around those trips, one I'd never thought much about until that night. Mark, on the road, became quieter. Not distant, exactly, just tired, in the specific way travel makes people tired, full of long days in conference rooms and forced small talk at networking dinners. His texts during these trips were short, practical, a little flat. Long day. Talked to 3 potential clients. Tired. Going to bed. Miss you. Can't wait to be home wasn't a text Mark sent casually. In 9 years, I could probably count on one hand the number of times he'd sent something like that from a work trip, and every time he had, it had been at the very end of a trip, the last night, when he was genuinely worn down and genuinely looking forward to coming home. It was, in its own small way, a kind of code between us, not a secret one, just a familiar one, the kind that develops in any long marriage. Miss you, can't wait to be home meant I am tired and a little lonely and I want to be back in our life again. So when I saw the photo, the rooftop bar, the string lights, the raised glasses, posted 40 minutes after that exact message, the wrongness wasn't really about the photo itself. People go out at conferences. Coworkers have drinks together, that's normal, even expected. the wrongness was about the gap. The version of the evening Mark had described to me, in 4 words, didn't match the version Ashley had just posted to several hundred people. I told myself, sitting there, that it didn't necessarily mean anything, I think now. Maybe he'd sent the text before going out. Maybe he'd gone reluctantly, just to be polite, and left early. There were a dozen explanations, and in that first hour, I ran through every single one of them, carefully, the way you check a smoke detector battery you're pretty sure is fine. I didn't text him about it. I told myself there was no need to, that bringing it up would mean admitting I'd been looking at his coworker's Instagram, which felt, even to me, a little strange, a little like checking up on him. So I put my phone down, finished my wine, and went to bed. But I didn't sleep well. And somewhere around midnight, lying awake in our bed, his side empty, the sheets cool, I found myself doing something I'd never done before in 9 years of marriage. I opened Ashley's profile again, and scrolled back through her recent posts, slowly, looking for something I couldn't have named yet, even to myself. The next morning, Mark called during his lunch break, a normal call, the kind we had every day he traveled. He sounded tired, a little hoarse, the way he always did by day 4 of a conference. "How's it going?" I asked, keeping my voice light, listening to myself do it. "Long, honestly can't wait to get home." He sighed, an ordinary sigh, the kind that comes from sitting in conference rooms for too many hours. "Last full day tomorrow, then I fly back Thursday morning." "Did you do anything fun last night?" I asked. I tried to make it sound casual, the kind of question you ask any traveling spouse, the kind that doesn't usually carry any weight. There was the smallest pause. Not long, less than a second, the kind of pause that, on any other day, I never would have noticed. "Not really," Mark said. "Same as the other nights, dinner with the team, then back to my room to catch up on emails." "I'm pretty wiped, honestly." "Dinner with the team, then back to my room." I thought about the rooftop bar. The string lights. The glasses raised at 10:27. "Sounds exhausting," I said. "It is. I'll be glad to be home." We talked for a few more minutes, about nothing, really, the kind of small talk that fills up a daily call, and then he had to get back to a session, and we hung up. That phone call is one I've replayed more times than I can count, I think now. Not because of anything dramatic in it, there wasn't anything dramatic. That's exactly what makes it so hard to let go of. He didn't sound nervous. He didn't sound like someone hiding something. He sounded exactly like he always sounded on day 4 of a work trip. And that's what scared me, eventually, not that he might be lying, but that if he was, I'd never have been able to tell. 9 years, and I genuinely couldn't tell. I went to work that day, taught 5 periods of sophomore English, graded a stack of essays during my prep period, had a fairly ordinary conversation with my closest friend at school, Stephanie, about a parent-teacher conference that had gone badly the day before. I didn't mention the photo to her. I'm not entirely sure why, except that saying it out loud, I think my husband might have lied about going out last night, felt like it would make it real in a way that, as long as it stayed in my head, it somehow wasn't yet. That evening, after dinner, I found myself back on Ashley's Instagram, not hiding it from myself this time, just sitting at the kitchen table with my laptop, scrolling slowly, the way you'd look for something specific even if you weren't sure what. The rooftop bar photo was still there, near the top of her profile. I looked at it again, more carefully this time. There were 6 people in the photo, 4 men, 2 women, all roughly Mark's age, all wearing the kind of after-hours business casual that conference attendees wear when they've taken off their lanyards but not changed clothes. Mark was at the edge of the frame, slightly out of focus, his sleeves rolled up, a drink in his hand, laughing at something off camera. He didn't look like someone hiding. He looked like someone having a normal night out with coworkers, which, I reminded myself, was exactly what it probably was. But the timeline still bothered me. 9:47, miss you, can't wait to be home, going to bed soon. 10:27, a rooftop bar, drinks raised, best night of the conference. I think this was the first moment I really understood something about myself, I think now. It wasn't that I thought Mark was cheating, not yet, not really. It was that I realized I had no actual way of knowing what his evenings on these trips looked like. I'd never needed to know, before. And needing to know, for the first time in 9 years, felt like its own kind of betrayal, not of trust exactly, but of the easy not thinking about it that had defined our whole marriage up to that point. I closed the laptop. I told myself I was being paranoid, that one slightly off phone call and one Instagram photo didn't add up to anything, that I was building a story out of nothing because I'd had too much wine and not enough sleep. I told myself all of this, and mostly, I believed it. Mostly. Mark came home Thursday evening, and for the first day or so, everything felt completely normal, almost aggressively normal, in a way that, looking back, I think was its own kind of signal, though at the time it just felt like relief. He was affectionate in the easy, familiar way he always was after a trip, a long hug at the door, dinner together at the table instead of standing at the counter, an evening on the couch where he actually put his phone away and we talked about nothing in particular, the small accumulated details of 4 days apart. He told me about the conference, the keynote speaker who'd run long, a client he thought might come through, the hotel's terrible coffee. He didn't mention the rooftop bar. I didn't ask. I want to be honest about something here, I think now. I had a choice, that first evening home, and I made it deliberately. I could have asked, simply, easily, the way you'd ask about anything. Oh, I saw a photo Ashley posted, looked like a fun night. It would have been nothing. A throwaway line. And depending on how he answered, it probably would have resolved everything, one way or another, right then. I didn't ask. And the reason I didn't ask is something I had to sit with for a long time afterward. I was afraid that if I asked, and the answer was fine, which it probably would have been, I'd feel relieved, but I'd also feel like I'd revealed something about myself. That I'd been checking up on him. That I didn't trust him. And somewhere along the way, in our marriage, not checking up on each other had quietly become the same thing as trusting each other, and I think, by then, some part of me had started to suspect those two things weren't actually the same at all. So I said nothing, and the days went on, and the small unease from that week slowly faded into the background of ordinary life, work, errands, weekend plans, the accumulated noise of two busy people sharing a house. I almost forgot about it entirely. It came back, unexpectedly, about 3 weeks later. Mark had another trip coming up, shorter this time, 2 nights, a client visit in Chicago, and the Friday before he left, we had dinner with his coworker Greg and Greg's wife, Lauren, at a restaurant downtown. Greg worked on the same sales team as Mark, he'd been at the Denver conference too. At some point during dinner, Lauren, making conversation, the way people do, asked Mark how the Denver trip had gone. Good, good, Mark said. Long, but good. Got a couple solid leads out of it. Greg said you guys had a pretty wild last night, Lauren said, smiling, glancing at Greg. Some rooftop bar thing? I felt my whole body go very still, in a way I tried hard not to show. Oh, yeah, that. Mark laughed, a little. That was. I mean, it was fine. Some of the team wanted to go out, I was pretty tired, I think I left pretty early actually. Early? Greg said, grinning, oblivious. Dude, you were there till, like, midnight. I remember because you were the one who. Right, Mark said quickly, cutting in with a laugh that sounded, to me, at least, very slightly forced. I forgot, yeah. It's all kind of a blur, honestly, those last couple days just run together. The conversation moved on, Lauren started talking about a trip she and Greg were planning, and within a minute or two, nobody at the table was thinking about Denver at all. Except me. I sat there for the rest of that dinner, smiling, eating, contributing to the conversation, and underneath all of it, one thought kept circling, he just lied. Not about anything dramatic. About whether he left a bar early or stayed until midnight. A small thing. The kind of thing that, on its own, means almost nothing. But it was the second time. The first time, on the phone, he'd said he went back to his room and caught up on emails. Now he was saying he'd been at the bar, but left early. Two different versions of the same night, both of them, I now knew, wrong, because Greg had just confirmed, without realizing it, that Mark had stayed until midnight. That detail seemed small at the time. It wasn't. Because what it told me wasn't about the bar at all. It told me that Mark had a story about that night, a story he'd told more than once, adjusting it slightly depending on who was asking, and that the story didn't match what had actually happened. And if there was a story, there was a reason for one. I didn't say anything that night either. We drove home, and Mark was relaxed, easy, talking about Greg and Lauren's trip plans, completely unaware, I think, that anything had shifted. And I sat in the passenger seat, looking out at the streetlights passing by, feeling something I hadn't felt in 9 years of marriage, the specific, lonely sensation of sitting next to someone you've shared a bed with for nearly a decade, and realizing you don't actually know what happened on a Tuesday night 3 weeks ago, and that he's decided, for reasons of his own, that you shouldn't. I didn't decide, that night, to start looking for anything. What happened instead was smaller, and slower, the kind of thing that, in hindsight, looks like an investigation, but at the time felt more like an itch I couldn't stop scratching. The first thing I did, a few days later, while Mark was at work, was go back to Ashley's Instagram, not just the rooftop bar photo this time, but further back, and further forward, looking at the full week of the conference. There were several posts from those 4 days, group photos at the conference itself, a few shots of the hotel lobby, the rooftop bar photo. And then, posted the next morning, the day Mark had told me, on the phone, that he was exhausted and looking forward to a quiet last day, there was one more photo. A breakfast spread, plates of food, coffee cups. The caption read, "Recovery breakfast. Needed this." 6 people were tagged in it. Mark was one of them. I sat with that photo for a long time, I think now. Not because a breakfast photo proves anything, it doesn't, not really. People have breakfast with coworkers all the time, it's about as innocent as anything could be. What got to me wasn't the photo itself. It was the caption. Recovery breakfast. The kind of joke you make after a night that needed recovering from. The kind of night Mark had told me, twice now, in 2 different versions, hadn't really happened. I want to be honest about what I did next, because it's the part of this story I'm least proud of, and the part that, looking back, I think was a genuine mistake, the kind that, if things had gone differently, might have made everything worse. I logged into our shared family phone plan account online, something I had access to, something I'd never had a reason to look at before, and pulled up Mark's call and text logs from the week of the conference. I told myself I was just looking for context, I think now. That's the phrase I used, in my own head, just looking for context. But that wasn't really true. I was looking for a name. I didn't know whose name yet. I just knew I was looking for one. What I found wasn't dramatic, no secret number, no string of late-night calls to someone I didn't recognize. Mostly the logs looked exactly like I'd expect, calls to me, calls to his office line, a handful of texts to Greg and a few other numbers I recognized as coworkers. But there was one number, a number I didn't recognize, no name attached, that appeared several times that week. Mostly texts, clustered in the evenings. Including one, on the Tuesday night, at 9:52 p.m., 5 minutes after Mark had texted me, "Miss you, can't wait to be home." I didn't have access to the content of the texts, just the log, numbers and timestamps. But I sat there at the kitchen table, looking at that timestamp, and felt something settle into place that I hadn't been ready for. 9:47, "Miss you. Can't wait to be home." To me. 9:52, a text, to an unknown number. 10:27, a photo, posted by Ashley, showing Mark at a rooftop bar. I didn't know, in that moment, whose number it was, I think now. Part of me, a part I'm not proud of, already suspected. But I also want to be honest, I'd built an entire narrative, by that point, around a handful of timestamps and one slightly too casual Instagram caption. I hadn't confirmed anything. I'd assembled circumstantial pieces into a shape that felt true, and the not knowing, by that point, had become almost worse than whatever the truth might actually be. That's the moment I think of now as the point where this stopped being something I could quietly let go of. Not because I'd found proof, I hadn't, not really. But because I'd crossed a line I couldn't uncross, I'd gone looking. And once you've gone looking, not knowing stops being a choice you can make again. I didn't confront Mark that night, or the next. Instead, I did something that, in retrospect, was its own kind of mistake, a moment where, if I'm honest, my judgment wasn't at its best. I texted the unknown number myself, from my own phone, a single message: "Hi, I think this number may have texted my husband's phone by mistake last month. Just wanted to check who this is." It was, I knew even as I sent it, a strange thing to do, invasive, a little dishonest in its own way, dressed up as a polite mix-up. But I sent it anyway, and then I sat there, phone in hand, waiting. The reply came about 20 minutes later: "Hi. This is Ashley, I work with Mark. Sorry for any confusion, I think we were just coordinating some conference stuff. Hope that helps," smiley face. Ashley. The same Ashley from the photos. The same Ashley who'd posted the rooftop bar picture, and the recovery breakfast caption. I stared at that message for a long time. Coordinating some conference stuff, at 9:52 p.m., 5 minutes after Mark told me he was going to bed. It was possible. It was, on its own, completely plausible. Coworkers text about logistics in the evening sometimes, especially during a conference. But combined with everything else, the two different stories about the bar, the timestamp, the caption, it didn't feel like coordination. It felt like the first thread of something I now had a name for, even if I still didn't know exactly what it was attached to. Looking back, the mistake wasn't that I texted Ashley, I think now. The mistake was that I did it alone, in secret, instead of just talking to Mark directly, which meant that by the time I finally did talk to him, I wasn't just bringing him a question anymore. I was bringing him an investigation. And there's a real difference between those two things, even when the underlying facts are the same. I confronted Mark on a Sunday evening, almost 5 weeks after the original text. I hadn't planned the timing, there was no strategy to it. It happened because, that afternoon, Mark's phone had buzzed while he was in the shower, and the notification had appeared on the screen, visible from where I was sitting. A text from Ashley, no preview of the content, just her name. I don't think, looking back, that the text itself meant anything. Coworkers text each other. Ashley's name appearing on Mark's phone wasn't, by itself, evidence of anything at all. But by that point, 5 weeks into carrying around timestamps and screenshots and a text exchange I'd never told Mark about, seeing her name appear, ordinary, unremarkable, was the thing that finally broke something loose in me. When Mark came downstairs, towel around his neck, I was sitting at the kitchen table, and I said, before I'd fully decided to say anything at all, "Can we talk about Denver?" Mark stopped. Something in his face shifted, not guilt, exactly, not yet. More like the particular stillness of someone who's been waiting for a conversation without knowing when it would come. "Sure," he said, carefully. "What about it?" "The last night. The rooftop bar." I kept my voice steady, though my hands, under the table, were not. "You told me, on the phone, that you went back to your room and caught up on emails. Then at dinner with Greg and Lauren, you said you went to the bar but left early. Greg said you were there until midnight." Mark's face had gone very still. "Renee. And Ashley posted a photo, from that bar, 40 minutes after you texted me, 'Miss you, can't wait to be home.' And the next morning, a breakfast photo, captioned 'Recovery Breakfast.'" I made myself keep my voice even, though it wasn't easy. "And there's a text from her phone to yours, at 9:52 that night. 5 minutes after your text to me." The silence that followed felt very long. "How do you," Mark started, then stopped, and something in his expression changed, not anger, but a kind of dawning realization, the look of someone watching a version of events assemble itself in front of him that he hadn't anticipated. Did you text her?" "Back in?" "Yes," I said. "I texted her. About a week ago. I didn't tell you I was doing any of this, and I know that's its own problem, and we can talk about that too. But right now, I need you to tell me what actually happened that night. Not the version on the phone. Not the version at dinner. What actually happened? Mark sat down across from me, slowly, the towel still around his neck, water dripping slightly onto his shoulders. For a long moment, he didn't say anything at all. Nothing happened, he said finally, quietly, not defensively, which somehow made it worse. I know how this looks. I know exactly how this looks, and I understand why you'd think. He stopped, ran a hand over his face. We went to that bar. The team, plus a few people from other companies at the conference. Ashley was there. We talked, a lot, actually, more than I probably should have. About work stuff, mostly, but also, some other stuff. Personal stuff. She's going through a divorce, and I think she just wanted someone to talk to, and he stopped again. And you didn't want to tell me, I said. No, he said. I didn't. Because I knew if I told you I'd spent half the night talking to a coworker about her divorce, on a rooftop, after telling you I missed you and was going to bed, it would sound like, he gestured, helplessly. Like this. Exactly like this. Did anything happen? I asked. The question I'd been carrying for 5 weeks, finally said out loud. No, Mark said. And then, more carefully, not in the way I think you mean. Nothing physical. I want to be completely honest with you, because I think I owe you that more than I've owed you anything in a long time. He took a breath. But I think, looking back, there was something. Not an affair. But something I let happen that I shouldn't have. I let myself have a conversation with her that I would never have had if you'd been standing next to me. I let it go on longer than it should have. And then, when I texted you miss you, can't wait to be home, I think some part of me was already feeling guilty about where I was, and I sent that text almost like a way of telling myself I hadn't actually gone anywhere. That I was still the guy who missed his wife. Even while I was sitting at that bar. I sat there, hearing him say all of this, and felt something I hadn't expected, I think now. Not relief, exactly, though there was some of that, somewhere underneath everything else. What I felt, mostly, was a kind of clarity. Because what Mark was describing, a conversation he shouldn't have had, going on longer than it should have, a text sent partly to reassure himself, wasn't the story I'd built in my head over 5 weeks. It was smaller than that, and in some ways, more uncomfortable, because it didn't have a clean villain. It was just 2 people, at a bar, late at night, both a little lonely, both letting something go on slightly too long, and one of them coming home and not saying anything about it. Why didn't you just tell me? I asked. Any of it. Even the boring version, I stayed out late talking to a coworker about her divorce. That's not even a betrayal, Mark. That's just a thing that happened. I know, Mark said quietly. I think that's actually the part one feel worst about. It wasn't even that big a deal, and I still couldn't tell you. And I think, the more I didn't tell you, the bigger it felt, until it felt like something I couldn't tell you. Even though, by then, there still wasn't really anything to tell. That sentence, the more I didn't tell you, the bigger it felt, is one I've thought about more than almost anything else from that conversation, I think now. Because it wasn't really about Ashley at all, in the end. It was about a small, ordinary moment of guilt that Mark had let calcify into a secret, simply by choosing, again and again, not to mention it, the exact same choice, I realized, that I'd been making for years, in smaller ways, about smaller things. Neither of us had lied about anything enormous. We'd both just gotten very good, somewhere along the way, at letting small true things go unsaid until they stopped feeling small. We didn't resolve everything that night. I think, looking back, that would have been impossible, and probably not even desirable, because the conversation we needed to have wasn't really about Denver at all, not by the end of it. What we did, that night and over the following weeks, was something slower and less dramatic. We actually talked. About Denver, yes, Mark told me more, eventually, about the conversation with Ashley, and I believed him, not because I had any way to verify it, but because the version he gave me had the texture of something true, messy, a little embarrassing, not heroic in either direction. But we also talked about other things, the quiet, accumulated habits of 9 years of marriage that had, somewhere along the way, made it easier to text miss you than to say I had a complicated night and I don't know how to bring it up. I told Mark about the screenshots, the call logs, the message to Ashley, all of it, even the parts one wasn't proud of. He didn't get defensive about it, which surprised me a little. Instead, he just looked tired and said, "I get it. I think if I'd seen what you saw, I'd have done the same thing." I think that was the moment I finally let go of something I'd been holding on to for 5 weeks, not suspicion, exactly, but a kind of bracing, the constant low hum of waiting for the other shoe to drop, I think now. Not because everything was suddenly fine. It wasn't. But because, for the first time since that Tuesday night, Mark and I were finally looking at the same version of events, messy, ordinary, a little sad in places, but the same version. And I realized that was something I'd actually missed more than I'd missed certainty, just being on the same page as the person I'd been married to for 9 years. A few weeks later, Mark told Ashley's manager, without my prompting, which mattered to me, that he thought it would be better if he wasn't assigned to the same project teams as her going forward, citing, vaguely, some personal stuff. He didn't go into detail, and as far as I know, nothing ever came of it professionally. Ashley, from what little I gathered afterward, never knew any of this had happened on our end at all. She'd just had a long night at a conference, talked to a coworker, and posted some photos the next day, completely unaware that, on the other end of a phone 3 states away, those photos had quietly unraveled something. I think about that sometimes. I think now. How much of what happened in our marriage that fall existed entirely inside 2 people's heads, Mark's guilt, my suspicion, while the person at the center of it all went on with her life completely unaware. It's strange, the way these things work. The damage isn't always proportional to what actually happened. Sometimes it's proportional to what almost happened, or what could have, or what one small unsent sentence allowed to grow in the dark. Mark still travels for work, a few times a year. The first trip after Denver, he texted me more than usual, not performatively, I don't think, just because something had shifted in him too. By the second trip, things had settled back into something more normal, though one thing had changed permanently, in a small way. When he calls now, from hotel rooms, he tells me about his evenings. Not in exhaustive detail, just enough that I'm not left assembling a version of his life from Instagram photos and phone logs. We went out with the team, stayed later than I meant to, talked to some people about work stuff and some other stuff. Kind of a long night. Small. Ordinary. True. What I understand now, looking back, is that the danger in our marriage was never really Ashley, or a rooftop bar, or even the text itself, I think now. The danger was the gap, the space between what actually happens in a life and what gets said out loud about it. Mark let that gap open up, just slightly, out of guilt and habit and the human instinct to avoid an uncomfortable conversation. And I'd been living, without realizing it, in a marriage that had plenty of room for gaps like that, because for 9 years, neither of us had ever needed to close one before. We're still married. Nothing about that fall ended anything, but it changed something, quietly, in the texture of how we talked to each other. Less performance. Fewer reassuring texts sent to make ourselves feel better. More of the boring, unglamorous truth, even when the truth is a little embarrassing. Some nights, I still think about that text, "Miss you, can't wait to be home," and the 40 minutes that followed it, I think now. Not with anger anymore. Just with a kind of quiet recognition, that sentence wasn't a lie, exactly. Mark did miss me. He did want to be home. He just also, in that same hour, wanted something else, a conversation, a connection, a feeling of being needed by someone who wasn't his wife, and he hadn't yet learned that those 2 things could coexist, and that admitting the second one wouldn't have to cancel out the first. What makes this story different from the kind of betrayal narrative it could so easily have become is that, in the end, there was no affair to discover, and yet something real still had to be confronted, something that, in its own way, was harder to name precisely because it had no clear edges. The text itself, "Miss you, can't wait to be home," is the detail worth sitting with longest, because of what it reveals about how people manage their own guilt in real time. Mark wasn't lying to Renee when he sent it. He was, in a sense, lying to himself, using the text as a way of reaffirming an identity, loyal husband, missing his wife, at the exact moment he was doing something that complicated that identity, even if only slightly. This is a much more common pattern than outright deception, and far harder to detect, because the person doing it often genuinely believes what they're saying in the moment they say it. Renee's investigation, the call logs, the message to Ashley, represents the story's most morally ambiguous stretch, and it's worth examining honestly rather than excusing. Renee wasn't wrong to notice the inconsistencies. 3 separate, conflicting accounts of the same evening is a legitimate reason for concern. But the choice to investigate alone, rather than simply asking Mark directly, created its own problem. By the time the conversation finally happened, it wasn't a conversation between 2 equal partners anymore. One of them had spent 5 weeks building a case, and the other had no idea a case was being built. That asymmetry could easily have turned a fixable situation into an unfixable one, not because of what Mark had done, but because of how cornered he might have felt by the accumulated evidence, regardless of how reasonable that evidence actually was. The real turning point of this story isn't the confrontation itself, it's Mark's answer to a single question: did anything happen? His response wasn't a denial dressed up to sound convincing. It was something messier and, ultimately, more credible, an admission that something had happened, just not the thing Renee feared, a boundary blurred, not broken, and a guilt that had been mismanaged rather than confessed. That kind of honesty, delivered at the most vulnerable possible moment, is rare, and it's what allowed the story to resolve the way it did. What this story ultimately illustrates is something many betrayal narratives miss: the most corrosive force in a relationship often isn't the big, dramatic act of betrayal, it's the small, ordinary failure to say an uncomfortable true thing out loud, repeated often enough that the gap between what's said and what's real becomes a place where suspicion, guilt, and eventually real damage can grow. What stays with me most about this story is how close it came to becoming something much worse, not because of what actually happened in Denver, but because of how easily 5 weeks of silence, on both sides, could have hardened into something neither Renee nor Mark could walk back from. Maybe that's the quiet warning underneath all of this. It's rarely the big lie that does the most damage. It's the small, manageable truth that someone decides, in the moment, isn't worth the discomfort of saying, and then has to keep not saying, again and again, until it isn't small anymore. The good news, if there is any, is that it's not too late to say it. Even 5 weeks later. Even after the screenshots. Sometimes the truth, even the embarrassing, unglamorous version of it, is still enough.